history of voting rights. Did you know that limited voting rights dates back to the 1700s, when the Founding Fathers accepted and endorsed severe limits on voting? At the time, the U.S. Constitution left it up to the states to determine their own voting laws. The state legislatures set a standard that only white men with land could vote. Some states even used religious tests to ensure that only Christian white men could vote. During the 1800s, with the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, and the Civil Rights Act of 1866, some official barriers to voting started to recede. What about women, you ask? Well, in 1890, Wyoming was the first state to allow white women the right to vote, according to their state constitution. Only a handful of states followed Wyoming's lead. After much activism, white women won the right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Women of color still had a long road ahead. In the 1960s, other barriers barring equal voting rights began to emerge, such as literacy tests, poll taxes, English language requirements, and more, to suppress the vote among people of color, immigrants, and low-income populations. In March 1965, protest marches were organized from Selma, Alabama, to Montgomery to shed a light on the denial of black voting rights. The first march, which has since been labeled Bloody Sunday, was the march where participants were brutally attacked, including U.S. Representative John Lewis. A second march was cut short, but finally, thousands of marchers arrived in Montgomery, where national attention was brought to the issue. With the spotlight firmly on unequal voting rights for people of color, several events occurred. The 24th Amendment was adopted on January 23, 1964, which prohibited Congress and the states from passing poll taxes to bar anyone from voting. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act passed Congress. An important part of this act, other than banning literacy tests, was that the federal government, the U.S. Department of Justice, could monitor and oversee voter registration and states' laws in states that had a history of discriminating against African American voters. Other voting rights improvements included changing the voting age to 18, protecting members of language minorities and people with disabilities, and allowing citizens to register to vote when they get their driver's license. Sounds great, right? Not so fast. In 2006, Indiana passed a strict voter ID law which required all voters to present a government-issued ID card before voting at the polls. Other states followed suit. This disproportionately disenfranchised low-income communities and communities of color, as they may not be able to afford an ID card. In Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act, so states and localities with a history of suppressing voting rights were no longer required to submit changes to their election laws to the Department of Justice. In response to this ruling, the Voting Rights Advancement Act was introduced and passed in the House of Representatives in December 2019 and was reintroduced in the Senate in June 2020. This legislation was renamed the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2023, which would restore and strengthen parts of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In August 2021, the House of Representatives passed the bill. The bill failed to pass in the Senate. It failed again in January 2022. The fight for equal voting rights goes on. Please exercise your right to vote. And let's remember, your vote is your voice, and your voice is your power. Let's use our voices to vote.